I am very excited to have here with us Rosie Whitehouse, who wrote this book called Two Sisters, that we're here to listen to a little bit of the story of it, to be in conversation around it, and also just to mark, as yesterday was International Holocaust Memorial Day. So it's very fitting that we are meeting today, this week, to hear a story of the Shoah, to hear the story of individuals. And that's really what it's about. If we have an experience in the Jewish history that is so vast, and focusing it in a little bit to hear one family story is very special. So thank you, Rosie, for being with us. I just want to give us all a little bit of an introduction. Rosie's a journalist specializing in Jewish life after the Holocaust, and she writes for BBC Online, The Observer, The Independent, Tablet Magazine, the Jewish Chronicle, Haaretz, and a lot of other places you can find her. She's a graduate of the London School of Economics and a historical advisor at the Vienna-based Centropa, which is a Jewish History Institute. And her first book, The People on the Beach: Journeys to Freedom After the Holocaust, was published in 2020. And she lives in London. And I also just want to do a plug because Centropa is an incredible resource. And it's really an honor to have someone who's an advisor for Centropa. So I highly suggest everyone also checking that out to see Rosie's kind of what you've been working on outside of the books that you're writing. It's and everything else that you're doing. So I think we can start. We'd love to just hear an overview. Here's the book, Two Sisters, Betrayal, Love, and Resistance in Wartime France, which really just, you could tell even from that you, Rosie, are a writer. You draw people in. You really find this way of telling a story. So I would love to start by, if you can just give us a general overview, anything you'd like to share. And then we're going to go into some Q&A and be in conversation. And if anyone on this Zoom, also, if you have questions, put it in the chat so that we can all see it, so that we can just keep ourselves organized and get to everyone's questions. But Rosie, I want to open it up to you to get us started.
Well, before we start, I'd just like to say that after everything that's been going on in Los Angeles, I'm extremely grateful that you've got time to listen to me. And I really hope that all your friends and relatives are safe and that we're sending you all our love from London. I'm just going to give a quick introduction to Two Sisters, and then we can talk about some of the themes that interest you afterwards. Two Sisters is a multifaceted book that you can approach on many levels. Fundamentally, it's in part a family story. And I emphasize that it's just part of what the book is about. So let's pause and take a look at that family story just for a minute. When I first met my husband, it was on our first date that he told me his grandma had been murdered in Auschwitz. Now, considering that this book is all about her, it's quite surprising that that night the conversation didn't linger on her, as we had a lot of other things to say to each other. Life swept us up, and my husband, who's a war reporter, and I moved in 1990 to Eastern Europe. The present pushed out the past. We had 5 children. There was war raging in former Yugoslavia. Not to say that in the middle of all this, I didn't often wonder what the details were behind the bare bones of the family story that I knew. My mother-in-law, Marion, always said that she lived 2 lives. The first was in France, where she lived from 1933 to 1960, and the second was in London. This is where we knew her as Granny Marion. She was a lovely lady who cooked us delicious dinners, especially on a Sunday, and shopped in Marks and Spencer. What she never said was that she actually lived 3 lives. The first was her childhood in Berlin, where she was born in 1920. And in 1933, the family, as I'm sure you've guessed by now, were Jewish, fled to Paris. Although Granny Marion did talk about the past, she wasn't forthcoming. And although I was intrigued by her story, I have to be honest, I knew better than to ask my mother-in-law questions I knew she didn't want to answer. When Granny Marion died in 2010, it fell to me to clear out her flat. And I found some extraordinary items in the back of her wardrobe. Her Vichy false identity card and pictures of her with her mother just before she was deported to Auschwitz and murdered. These pictures really were extraordinary because she always said she had no pictures of her parents. So I was totally bowled over to find these pictures. But our life was still just as busy, and these things soon found their way into our house and found their way into the back of my husband's wardrobe, and there they sat until we made a trip to San Francisco in 2019 to see Granny Marion's sister, Huguette, my husband's aunt Huguette. She's lived in San Francisco since 1947. And I said this is in part only a story about Granny Marion, because it was Huguette who set me on the path that turned this into a book. Huguette fell in December 1943 while skiing in the resort of Val d'Isère with Marion. It was not long after her mother had been sent to Auschwitz. The local doctor, Dr. Petrie, was called. Dr. Petrie wanted Huguette to go to the hospital down in the valley below, but Granny Marion refused, and she punched him in the face. This is quite shocking for my mother-in-law, who was a very gentle lady. The doctor immediately realised what was going on and offered to hide Huguette until the break repaired. That much we always knew, but what Marion and Huguette were doing on a holiday in the middle of a war was never clear to me. And it was on that visit to San Francisco in 2019 that Huguette asked me how she could thank the family of Dr. Petrie. And equally as importantly, she asked me why he had taken the risk of hiding a 15-year-old stranger. She also asked me why other people had offered fleeting acts of kindness that saved her life. I was actually quite shocked that nobody in our family had thought before about trying to say thank you to the Petrie family, or at least finding out the name of the doctor who had saved her. The answer to these questions is the core of what Two Sisters is really about, because answering Huguette's questions revealed to me that in France during World War II, public opinion really mattered, and that the Nazis weren't as all-powerful as we like to imagine they were, and the way that they're portrayed on TV and film screens. It took me years of research to answer Huguette's questions, in the process of which I managed to have Dr. Petrie recognized as righteous among nations by the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Yad Vashem. And I have to say, he is a real role model. This book grew partly out of the evidence that we presented to them, but it's much, much more than that. It's not simply a story of two sisters, but asking these questions, Huguette turned the spotlight from the victim and the perpetrator, and she shone it on the bystanders, asking, what would you have done in the Holocaust? It's a really important moral question. What would you have done? As I said, the book is multifaceted and you can take it on whatever level you want. I think here the subtitle is really what matters. Love. This book is the story of Marion and Huguette's love for each other and their mother's love for them. But it's also about Dr. Petrie's love of humanity, his ability to care for a total stranger. Yes, on a family level, when it comes to betrayal, there was the harsh fact that their father left their mother for his mistress in their moment of need. But there is a story that's far bigger, a betrayal than a betrayal of that of a husband. It's the betrayal of Germany and France of their Jewish citizens. And the third word in the subtitle, resistance. To my surprise, when I was writing this book, I discovered the extraordinary extent of armed resistance in France. Maybe why we don't actually know anything about this, we can talk about in a minute, because it's quite interesting, quite an important facet of how the Holocaust is remembered and was initially remembered. And then, bingo, I found out that Granny Marion and her first husband, Pierre, played an important role in this resistance. I have to say, looking back on it, I'm quite surprised that I really didn't find a pistol and some grenades in the back of Granny Marion's wardrobe, to be honest. But Dr. Petrie is the real hero of Two Sisters, and his story raises important moral questions. Above all, anything else, it poses the question, what would you do to help a stranger? And I think that's what really makes Two Sisters a story that's relevant to the 21st century and beyond. I mean, obviously, as you just mentioned, that yesterday was Holocaust Memorial Day. It prompts people to ask what's going to happen when we no longer have any survivors, and what are these questions which need to remain to inspire people. And I think Dr. Petrie's acts do inspire people, because as I write in the book, I originally, when I was trying to get him recognised as righteous among nations, I've telephoned up the town hall in Val d'Isère to ask them if they would endorse our move to have him made righteous among nations. The then mayor, to my enormous surprise, told me he thought it was cock and bull and he didn't believe a word of it. And the new mayor is far more supportive. But this story shocked me so much. So what it means now is that school children in Val d'Isère will learn about the story of Dr. Petrie. And this really matters. It means they have a hero in their town. And also, as you can read in the book, I always found Val d'Isère a rather cold and frightening place. I can't ski. And our nephew died in a skiing accident very close by. But what surprised me was that when we had Dr. Petrie recognised as righteous among nations, that suddenly all these other hidden Jewish families came out and joined in the celebrations. And Val d'Isère suddenly came to me an incredibly warm and friendly place. And, you know, these Jews were hidden and these stories have remained hidden. And I think that it's very important that we try to bring them out for the future and think about the role of the righteous more than I think we have done, particularly here in Britain, where we hardly have any righteous. I mean, obviously, we were not occupied. Well, only a tiny part of Great Britain, the Channel Islands, was occupied by the Nazis. But I hope that gives you an idea of a little bit about what the book's about. And, you know, there was certainly a lot more to Granny Marion than shopping in Marks and Spencer's. That's what I discovered.
Well, absolutely. Thank you so much for just giving us that overview. And, you know, your book, as you said, and these people in your family are ones who ask big questions. And they ask these big theological questions that the world struggles with. And I'm curious, you know, for you, as you have focused on life after the Holocaust. You know, there's a lot of historians that focus on the history of the Holocaust, but your focus, from what I understand, is life after the Holocaust. And what was the most surprising to me, I mean, there are a lot of things that are, you know, surprising, and as you're reading, oh my goodness, and it's amazing, these incredible stories. But you have two sisters who ended up being so different. Extremely different personalities, extremely different responses to their experience. And I'm curious, you know, from you, what was that process like of seeing these two individuals who grew up together, who had so much love for one another, but were vastly different in how they internally and externally responded to their own story?
Yeah, I mean, first off, it was always totally baffling to me why Granny Marion was quintessentially French. She had a French accent when she spoke English, but Huguette had a German accent. You know, how could this possibly be? Huguette went on to become a French teacher when she moved to the United States. I could never understand this. And in part of doing the research, I came to the answers of why this very simple difference between the two of them existed. And one was because Huguette was a very small little girl. She was only 6 when they moved in a great hurry from Berlin to Paris. And her father, quite in retrospect, quite rightly, insisted that they only spoke French. He was fluent in French. He'd studied in Paris before the war. And he insisted that his daughters and his wife only spoke French. My heart goes out to Edith with this because I've spent most of my life struggling to try to get somewhere near competence in French. And I know what it's like. Granny Marion took to this like a duck to water, but Huguette refused to speak for over 6 months. And I think this is really important when we think about refugee children and children who are enduring things like this today. I mean, my sister's a special needs teacher here in London, and she looked after two little girls from Afghanistan who refused to speak for 2 years until she suddenly persuaded them to speak. So it's quite common experience with young children. And I think because Huguette always had this slight resistance to speaking French, that she actually kept her her German accent. I also highly suspicious that in the period she spent with her mother, when they were privately alone, that their mom that she spoke German to her. Whereas Marion was older, she was sent away to boarding school, and she was much more like her father than I think she cared to admit. She absolutely loathed her father. But she saw the sense in becoming quintessentially French. And being quintessentially French is not just about being able to speak French, to look French. It's about knowing what cake is in the boulangerie. And my children actually have this total ability to name every single French cake. It goes on down through the generations. But this was really, really important. And it was what saved Granny Marion's life eventually, because when she joined the Jewish resistance as a courier, she could hide behind a totally French identity and pass as French, which was absolutely crucial. And you get the difference between the two of them was, and I think some of this has to do with age and experiences, is that Granny Marion was always deeply resentful about what happened to her. She always made us feel that the Holocaust was a very dark place and it was quite dangerous to go there. But Huguette, and I think this is because of Dr. Petrie, looked upon things quite differently. She spent 6 months stuck at the top of the Alps talking to Dr. Petrie. And I think that he instilled in her an understanding that her sister didn't have, and that she was very forgiving about what her father had done. I mean, he had a mistress. He'd always had mistresses. But in June 1940, one of the reasons that he chose not to leave France was that he didn't want to leave his mistress. And then in October 1940, just as things were getting really difficult, he went back to Paris with his mistress and abandoned his wife, Edith, and Huguette, and well, Marion too, but by this point, Marion was 20. And I think that this is the hand of Dr. Petrie coming down through the ages, through the decades. And I think that when you get asked these questions, she actually passed that on to us. It was something that we had no idea of. And it made us as a family feel very differently about the whole experience, which was very uplifting, I think.
Yes, and it's interesting highlighting kind of these two men in the story. There's the father figure, their father, who is, for Marion, it seemed, for me reading this, was really the source of betrayal. And she was older. She for sure knew more about what his life was, who were, and kind of the betrayal that she felt there. Whereas for Huguette, Dr. Petrie was really a focal male figure in her story. So they had very different experiences of just what were their core pieces of the experience they went through and who were the main characters. Most.
I think on one hand, you can be very quick to judge Johannes. Funnily enough, I was just driving in the car with my daughter the other day, and she goes, "So what do you really think he was like?" And I said, I think he was a very difficult and mixed character. And I think we have to remember that, he was suffering betrayal long before Edith. That he had his foot blown off in the First World War. That's not a great start to life. And then, of course, there was this census in Germany to look into the loyalty of German soldiers. It was really a slap in the face for German Jewish soldiers. I mean, for Jewish soldiers who'd served in the war and particularly been injured. He wanted to be a lawyer. That didn't happen. He ended up falling in love with Edith, and then he ended up being dominated by his mother-in-law, who basically sucked the entire family into the textile manufacturing business that she run as a matriarch, which can't have been great for her sons-in-law, I really have to admit. And it must have been very difficult. And I think when the final betrayal came in 1933, I think he leapt at the opportunity to go to France. His brother went to America. He always resented his older brother, who became a very successful doctor, orthopedic surgeon in New York. He always resented him. He had a lot of chips on his shoulder, but he really wanted to build a new life in France. He put all of his trust in France. And that's when I think it's the bigger betrayal than the betrayal that happened with Germany, because he wanted to build this. He became a very successful film producer in France, and then that job was stolen away from him. So, and there was this story which we always knew, that he took Huguette to the banks of the Seine, and he dropped his Iron Cross in the Seine, and then he went to America, where he reinvented himself for the third time. I mean, that's saying Granny Marion always loathed her father, but she did go and see him in San Francisco, and she was very proud of aspects of things that he did, and his career, and the films that he made, and she was working with him making these films.
You went to go work with him on the films, and clearly saw this creative side of him that.
Yeah, so I think he's a lot more complicated than maybe I was able to do him justice in the book, because he never talked about what happened. We don't know. It's highly likely he was involved in some kind of underground activities in Paris. If it was just selling on the black market, maybe. But when Edith was taken to Drancy, he knew exactly where to go to get money, and he knew that you could bribe the guards at Drancy. The trouble was that the commandant of Drancy had just changed, and that had all come to an end. But he knew how these things work. So he was probably up to something. What, we will never know.
Right. And that's something that I'm also interested in hearing about is, what's this process of learning that you have to do to write a book like this? Because you are working with some family members who share a lot, and who might be very open with information and open with their past. And then you also have family who never talked about their experience. And that really then was left to the research that you did. So I would love to hear just about, what was that process of finding the right information to piece together the story?
Well, the book grew in a slow way initially. And I'm a freelance journalist, and bizarrely enough, in September 2019, I found myself with absolutely no work. And when you're a freelance journalist, you never know if you're ever going to work again. So I thought, well, how am I going to keep myself occupied? So I thought I'd write this story down for the grandchildren. And that's how it began. And I thought I must find Dr. Petrie. And then when we found Dr. Petrie, and Huguette and I decided that we would put his case forward to Yad Vashem, because it was pretty clear cut. I was told it could take years to have him recognized as righteous among nations. In fact, it took less than a year. But then, as I began to discover the story of what was going on in Val d'Isère, I began to realize that I had a news story, and I sold it to BBC Online, where I wrote a story which came out in January 2020 about what happened in Val d'Isère that winter. And I was in the process of discovering other things about my mother-in-law, exactly what she could have been doing there. I was beginning to put these pieces together. I then also went to the National Archives here in London, and I found the SOE file of her first husband, because her first husband was involved in the non-Jewish resistance in Lyon. And in the winter of 1942, basically the Gestapo clamped down on the resistance in Lyon. It was infiltrated by collaborators, and he was briefly arrested and taken to the notorious headquarters of Klaus Barbie, the Hotel Terminus, and he managed to get out. And he then decided that he was going to walk over the Pyrenees and go to Spain and try to make his way to London, which he did. He was away for 18 months, in which period Granny Marion was alone. But I found his file, and then I found the story of what happened to him after he was parachuted back into into France. He was parachuted into the Toulouse region. It was called R4 in the code names at the time. And interestingly, he was Jewish of Alsatian origin from Paris, and he was parachuted into this region with a Protestant guy who was his boss. He was to be the saboteur, to blow things sky high. And they went to this tiny village called Varbre, and it was only COVID lockdown got in the way of me getting my car and going to Varbre, but eventually I made it. And in Varbre, I discovered many files which are actually still classified, and they were just sitting in a cupboard in Varbre, so it was my lucky day. And it revealed this amazing story of this Protestant village where the Protestant Maquis worked very closely with the Jewish Maquis, and it was Pierre Aymin and Schlumberger, the emissaries from London. It was their job to join this Maquis together and to integrate them into the Free French, which they did. So this began to reveal a lot more one after the other. So it came literally in bits and bits and bits. It was like putting together like a massive jigsaw.
Yeah. And that's what it almost felt like in a beautiful way in your book, that it was almost like peeling back these different layers that were unfolding. And, kind of also how you wrote the book is where we get to watch the story of your family, but we also get to watch you unfold this story. So how did you decide to write it this way? I mean, you're a journalist, so you're in the story in an amazing way of kind of reading about, okay, what was it like when you went and met Petri's family, and we're seeing that side, and then we also get inside as if we're in the story with Marianne and Bet, and kind of we go back and forth.
Yes, I mean, I think, well, I mean, obviously there are parts of the book where it is very much talking about my family. I mean, there was, as I mentioned in earlier, my husband's a war correspondent, and Granny Marion often used to talk more when he wasn't there. Whether that's because she didn't want him to know about things, or I don't know. But one lunchtime, and my 10-year-old daughter, Rachel, my middle daughter, she was invited to Granny Marion's for lunch because it was Wednesday afternoon. And in France, there's no school on Wednesday afternoon. So she went to Granny Marion's for lunch. And Granny Marion said to her, during the war, I was in a forest hiding out with other people, and I went to collect water with somebody else. And when I came back, all the people I was hiding with were dead. Rachel, being 10, just had no idea what to say. Granny Marion went and got the oven chips out of the oven, and nothing else was ever said about it again. And when Rachel came back, she told me, and I was a bit like, oh, good grief. What was she doing saying this? I should have gone for the lunch, all this kind of stuff you always think. And was subsequently, was actually when I was writing the book that I began to realize that maybe Granny Marion said that because she wanted Rachel to know my husband was in Baghdad. It was during the invasion of Iraq. And I think she wanted to sort of say, war's quite normal. Granny's been there too, so don't panic. So there were certain things that I wanted to bring over in the book like that about how it is to live with this story, because not everybody has the Holocaust story in the back drawer, and I was trying to get that across, particularly to both Jewish readers who don't have that experience, but particularly to non-Jewish readers, because it drives me bonkers that people always think that the Holocaust is something you teach in a history lesson. It is not. It's something that people live every day. I mean, we saw all the survivors on TV. They're still living it, aren't they? I mean, it's not history, so their families are, ergo. And you can't just package it up and just get rid of it. I mean, I've seen a lot of how that works in war-torn countries. The moment they start selling the postcard, it's all been repackaged and everyone's supposed to forget about it. But you can't. It lives on every day with you. And that's something I wanted to bring out in the book. I felt that was really important. But also, as you said, I'm a journalist. And I know that the only way to find out about something is to go there. And if you don't go somewhere and you don't look at the place it happened and see if you can talk to people on the ground about what happened, that you won't really understand it. You just can't. You have to see it with your own eyes. And so Two Sisters is very much part of that The last book I wrote, to the people on the beach, was also very much like that. I drove in my car, taking the journey that Jews took out of Europe. I mean, I'm a kind of, if you want to call me a road trip historian or something like that, that kind of gives you an idea
I
of
like that. That's
what I.
that gives a good idea of kind of who you are and how you do your work.
Yeah, and it's very important to talk to the other people and to find out how these things are being remembered. But it was a very slow level of discovering things. I mean, there was one thing that I discovered which was really extraordinary, right at the very end of the editorial process at Two Sisters. And the editor at Union Square, she kept going to me, this story of the children, 4,000 children who were deported from Drancy to Auschwitz, it doesn't belong in this book. And I was like, oh my God, this story is so traumatic. I want to tell it because people don't know it, even though it was a really important story in the Eichmann trial. I thought, I really want to tell this story. And for some reason, I was really driven to tell this story. And I was sitting on the sofa in my office, and in front of it, there was at this time a terrible old, filthy, ugly TV that had belonged to Granny Marion. And it was sitting on an old leather suitcase. And I thought, I was in a bad mood. And I just thought, I've had enough of this stupid TV. I never watch TV here. So I picked it up and went and put it out in the street. I live in a part of London where if you put anything out in the street, it's gone in 5 minutes. And then I came back in and I decided to open the box. I thought, what's in this suitcase? I opened it up. And in it were all these pictures and letters and postcards from my kids that they'd given to Granny Marion. And I thought, oh, that's sweet. But in the middle of it all was a freezer bag, properly closed. And in it was two newspaper cuttings. And I thought, oh, what is this? So I opened it up. And it was two newspaper cuttings about two little boys who had been among the 4,000 who were deported to Auschwitz without their parents, I will say. The parents had already gone. And they were deported with other adults in order to trick anybody who might see these transports and think it was families being resettled. And it was so extraordinary when I found this. There was also a photograph of Granny Marion with a man at a party somewhere in these, all dated from the 1990s. Nobody in the family had any idea or ever heard these people's names or any idea who this man was in the picture. But I then discovered that their two older brothers were in the Jewish resistance in Lyon, and they must have known Granny Marion, and that is why she had kept the story of these two little boys. And it was really weird. It was almost like she was standing next to me. It was really strange. And, so it was a very long, drawn process telling the story.
Thank you for sharing. You mentioned about kind of starting of who is this book for, right? Of who should be hearing this story? Who is it written for? And I would love to hear from you a little bit about that, of who did you write this for? Who do you want to hear it? And also in the back of the book, you have all these questions for discussion, which I very much appreciated and kind of cues us to know this isn't just a book to read. This is a book to discuss. This is a book to ask questions. It's a book that kind of rose, you get asking these big questions, and then you conclude the book with saying, here's questions to talk about. So who is this book for and what should we be doing with it?
Well, firstly, the book is dedicated to my husband, Tim. And he always had lots and lots of questions that were unanswered. So above all, it's a book for him. It was a book for our children and for our grandchildren who were born when I was writing the book. When we went to the ceremony where Dr. Petrie was given his award in Val d'Isère, my eldest daughter was pregnant, and now we have a grandson called Elio, who's 2.5, and we also have Rafi, who's 1. So above all, I think the book was for them. But you write a book for a bigger audience, and because I was at the same time writing articles for the BBC, which grew into this book, I was also well aware that there were lots of people out there who were interacting with this story. I mean, they got enormous hits of up to 2 million people read these stories. And that is, actually, because when I originally decided I was going to sell the story of what happened in Val d'Isère to the BBC, my daughter Rachel, she was very supportive and helped me, but the rest of the family were all a bit like, well, who's ever going to be interested in you getting a broken leg? Well, my answer was like 2 million people, guys. But also the engagement that the people had with the stories. You can Rachel works at the BBC, so I have all this info. The engagement that people spent reading the stories was also phenomenal. So that was very encouraging, and there were all kinds of people who I met, who had read this story. There was one gentleman whose mother had come to the UK on kinder transport, and he had a holiday house in Val d'Isere, and he wanted to put up a tree for Dr. Petrie. There were like all these people, so I was always aware that there were lots of people out there who should read it. I mean, I've also always wanted to make my books, very, very readable, and something that you could read quickly in one sitting, or when you're tired, like you said that you were tired and you're reading it. So I'm super glad to hear it cut through the pressures of family.
That I was reading it on a trip, and every night, I wasn't tired. That's what was surprising. Like sometimes you read a book, you're like, okay, I'll read a little bit and then go to sleep. But as I was reading, I think, as you said, it's very readable. It's something that you sit and you can keep going and keep reading. And you wrote it in a way that is for anyone to pick up and read. Of course, it's a heavy, intense story, but like it keeps you, you want to keep going. You want to find out what happens. You want to see kind of how does this unfold.
And I wanted also for younger people to be able to read it. I wanted it to be accessible for, depending on people's reading age, but so that people in their late teens could actually sit down and engage with it. I mean, I'm a mom. I've got 5 children, so I've always wanted. I mean, they're all grown now, but I've always wanted to engage with younger. I'm not saying younger readers, not like it's whatever it's called, preteen lit or something. It's hardly that, but also to be able to bring in students and other people and widen understanding.
It's very accessible. It's I think, as you're saying, like it really can reach a lot of different groups of readers.
And for that, it's on these multifaceted levels. I mean, you can take it as simply as you want or as complicated as you want. You can go as deep into the story of what happened to France's Jews and what was happening with the resistance if you feel like it, or you can just simply take it as a family story. So, and I don't mind whichever way you take it. But you were saying about the questions at the back of the book. Well, I'm glad you like them, because I thought this was a very strange thing to happen. I don't know, maybe it's a very American thing. I'd never seen it in a book before. But funnily enough, at the launch last week in London, there were a couple of people who said, "Oh, I bought this for friends of my daughters who brought the book because they remembered Granny Marion. They bought the book and go, oh, I'm going to give it to my mom. She goes to a book club." And I said, "Oh God, at the back there are all these questions," and they were like, "Oh my goodness, that's so perfect." And so it just goes to show you need a good editor to show you what's doing. And I was very lucky. I had a brilliant editor, Claire Watchell, at Union Square.
Right. Yeah, because, I think exactly, whether it's a book club, whether it's students reading it in school, like you're giving a guide at the end of what do you do with this information? What questions can you engage with afterwards, as opposed to just, okay, close the book, put it down, move on.
Yeah, I think they work well as well because, people don't really associate France with the Holocaust.
Right.
I mean, it took my husband a long time to realize that you could actually classify his mother as a Holocaust survivor. So it was even in the 4 walls of this house that this was happening. And people really don't understand what happened. They don't understand the differences between what happened in Poland, what happened in France, what happened in Italy, what happened in Romania. And I think that these questions do help you to think a little bit more about what was actually happening in France and why public opinion mattered. Public opinion mattered in certain countries in Nazi-occupied Europe. Polish public opinion didn't matter 2 hoots in Poland, but it did matter in some countries. That's one of the big questions about what happened in Hungary, is that if Horthy had actually stood up to the Nazis and said no way, maybe it would have been different. We will never know.
Yeah. the one more thing that I just about more the format of your book, of how you put it together, is at the end, you did all this research on all of these other individuals. And I would love if you could just tell us a little bit about that, of who they are and what brought you to include that piece as well, which, is also, as you said, like, this is not necessarily seen in a lot of books that you pick up where, you see kind of the background of many individuals involved, like the question, but I think it created such a richness to what you were sharing.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, I'm a bit of a queen of lists, let's put it that way. In the first book that I wrote, The People on the Beach, is about one illegal immigrant ship that sailed from Italy to Haifa. And at the back of that book, I listed the names of all the people who sailed on the boat. I'm very glad I did, because subsequently lots of people got in contact with me and I began to get a bigger picture of what was going on, which increased my understanding. I'm also the historical advisor to an organization here in the UK called the 45 Aid Society. And they represent 730 child and teenage Holocaust survivors who were brought to the UK after the war. And I have spent the last 10 years almost working out their story, because like so many Holocaust survivors, they didn't know their story, just like us. That was partly a prompt. This experience was partly a prompt for me to write Two Sisters. Really, I began to realize that, like the people I work with every day, we were just as bad. And one of the jobs that I had to do there was to make a list, the definitive list of the 732 people. So I deal a lot in lists, and we have to, unfortunately, much of the Holocaust has to do with lists of people going to ghettos, list of being going to labor camps, list of people going on a death march, list of survivors. It's list. So if you study the Holocaust, you get quite used to working with lists. But to me, I was incredibly surprised when I went to the Musée de la Shoah in Paris to do research on the convoy that Edith was taken on, convoy number 61. The lady at the Musée de la Shoah showed me her name on the list, and she gave me one page, and the whole list is accessible online. And I realized that when I read the detail of what actually happened at Drancy when you were taken to the station at Bobigny, that you were lined up. It's always numbers of 5 in the Holocaust. Everyone's always in a line of 5. This is why, I have no idea, but the Nazis were obsessed with the number 5. Why not 6? Why not 10? No idea. But it's always a line of 5, and they were lined up in lines of 5, and they were grouped in sets of 50 and put on this wagon. It wasn't, I mean, for Holocaust standards, it wasn't that particularly overcrowded, one has to say, but still extremely unpleasant. And then I realized that if they were dealt with like this and they went in a bus by 50 people, that actually you could break this list up into 50 people. And it was actually a really quite shocking revelation when I suddenly thought, these are 50 people that Edith spent the last days of her life with. And then I thought, who the heck are they? So I started clicking around, and I discovered that there was a mother and daughter who had been at the same school as Huguette, and I wondered whether she might have known her from the playground or Parents' Day. I have no idea. And then I thought, well, this is who gets her story told in the Holocaust is like incredibly random. Edith might have faded from everybody's memory if I hadn't decided that I was going to write this book. So it's kind of still a bingo whether you get remembered, 80 years after the day. And I thought it was terribly unfair. And I thought it was really not nice to all the other people who were in the wagon. Now, that was my reaction. When some of the kids found out what I was getting up to, they go, "Mommy, you've gone too far this time." And then I thought, And then I sat and I thought, well, maybe they're right. And then I thought, no, they're not right. They're wrong. And that it's important to include these names. And I'm very glad that I did do that. I think it's trying to put these stories in context and remember that that sometimes if you read a Holocaust memoir or a book about a Holocaust survivor, that you can forget that there are all these other people You can even often forget that behind each Holocaust survivor are, you know, tens of people. You know, they lost, you know, the one I was looking at only a few days ago, he registered 65 members of his family at Yad Vashem. I mean, behind all of these people are these huge lists of numbers. So when I'm talking about the 732 children who came to the UK, we're actually talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people whose story we're trying to tell, and that in fact we're building a massive new website about it, which I'm writing, and you know, really it's trying to bring across this idea of like trying to name the brothers and sisters where we can, and the parents, because you know this is what matters. It's not yay hey he survived. It's like uh-oh, you know.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that, because I think exactly as you said, it really gives context to every single individual has a story, whether it's told or not. There is a story there. There is a person there. And it's a reminder of that. You including that in this book, just a little paragraph about all these people, it almost opens it up to say, oh, each one of these people could have had a book written about them. That they have a whole story to them, whether somebody's writing it or not. So it was very special to also have that at the conclusion, because it was almost saying, I felt it was saying, okay, this is where I'm ending this piece of our family story. Now look at this whole list of people who have their own stories. And now here's all these questions that you can ask and engage with. So it really kind of drew you in. And that's why I was also curious. It felt like a book made for educators in a lot of ways, by educators and for educators, because you give all of this additional information. That's also what I felt as I was reading it, and you know, seeing it from that perspective.
Well, that's probably true, because I work in Holocaust education,
Right.
so, and particularly here in the UK, telling the story of this group of children. They're known here in the UK as the boys, even though there were 200 girls. So there we go. That was the 1950s boy. But we work to use that story as a Holocaust education tool here in Britain. So yes, I do work with educators, and so I suppose I went to Yad Vashem. I was Yad Vashem trained. I suppose that there is that element to me. Whereas you know, particularly writing our new 45 website, I'm always very careful to put labor camp, concentration camp, just really to make sure that people have got this wording correct, and they don't think that Treblinka was some kind of holiday camp, you know. And it's very, terminology is important. So I suppose it creeps in a little bit just into the stuff that I do. It's inevitable.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Just looking at our time, I would love to hear about what came after this book. What have you been working on since? What's next? What's kind of what can we see from you?
Well, I finished this book, actually, it's quite extraordinary, about 2 years ago.
Mm.
And you know, the process of writing a book is an extraordinarily long one. You have to go to your agent, then your agent has to try and sell it, and then you give up. And I have this terrible problem actually as an author, is that I tend to write books and then send them to my agent. I think it must be wonderful if somebody gives you some money to write a book first off, but that's never happened to me. And so it took, you know, 2 years, and at moments you feel quite downhearted and think you never see the light of day. So I can't believe my luck that I'm talking to you guys about it. But yes, I carried on with my educational work with the 45 Society. Yes, I do do stuff with Centropa, and I carried on writing articles and just doing things you do as a freelance journalist. And then I'm also a travel writer, which I think is quite important when it comes to understanding the style of this book. And that one of the things I do is to write guidebooks, and I've written a guidebook to the region of Italy called Liguria, which is in northwestern Italy. It's the area around Genoa. It's the real Riviera, you know, not the Amalfi Coast one. This is the real McCoy. And we spent a lot of time there. I know a lot about it. That was how I discovered the story of the illegal immigrant ship, the Josiah Wedgwood, because it sailed from Liguria. And I was talking to my editor at Brat Travel, who I work for, and she said, oh, we wanted to go into the 4th edition of Liguria. And then I said, oh, how are you doing? Because COVID was really bad for travel guides, I have to say. And she goes, oh, we're diversifying into thematic guidebooks. And before I realized what I'd said, well, there's a very good one you could write about the Holocaust. And within 10 minutes, I found out that I'd just suddenly been signed up to write this guidebook without realizing what I'd let myself into. So then I had just over a year to write this guidebook. I've got a copy of it here in front of me. This is it's the Holocaust. It's a guide to Europe's sites, memorials, and museums by Bratt. And that was perhaps one of the hardest pieces of work I have ever done. Because it involved me getting in my car, and I've visited many of these sites over the years, but I had some of them you have to go back to, others you've not been to. So basically, I spent months and months and months and months driving around Europe in my car, which is usually how I write books. It's about me and my car, and actually, it's a joke of people on the beach. I did dedicate part of the book to the car because it was just me in the car. And but anyway, this book looks at all of the main sites, memorials, and museums. Obviously, it's selective. You can't list every scene of a massacre, unfortunately. And it's also bang up to date because, as I said, my husband's a war correspondent, so I was able to. He was in Ukraine, so on the side while he was reporting from the trenches, he was also out checking out my Holocaust sites. And what I think is different about this book, there are books already in the market which can tell you what to see at Auschwitz or what to see here and what to see there, but nobody actually tells you how to get there, how much it costs, what's the best time of day to go, what to expect when you get there, because I mean, Auschwitz is well-known classic one. There's on a piece of road which doesn't belong to the memorial, there's a person selling ice creams and fridge magnets, and it can all be a little bit discombobulating, let's put it that way. But also discombobulating is to go to a completely deserted place and find you are completely alone. And as a guide writer, I've felt that this was, you have to warn people of this, particularly women traveling on their own. I mean, I went to Latvia this time last year, and I went to Lipaia, which is where women, children, and elderly Jews were shot on the beach. It's a really disturbing place. I got a taxi to take me to this massacre site, and the taxi man, he didn't really know where he was going, and we go deep into this forest on the edge of the freezing Baltic, and he stops the car, and then I got out of the car and I walked to the memorial site, and then I realized that I was completely alone, and I thought, oh my God, this is not safe. I thought I'd better get out of here as fast as possible. And then I went back to the car. I was thinking, oh God, I hope this taxi driver's decent and that he hasn't driven off or something. I was like, how the hell do you get back into town? It really looked dangerous. And then he was standing there and he was looking at the notice board, and he just said, his English wasn't very good, and he just said, Madam, I'm so sorry. I live here all my life. He was like 60, and he said, I never heard of this. So, I think that's why a guidebook like this needs to be written, because you can advise people how to travel to sites, and some of them are very remote. You can prepare people who've never been before and have nothing to do with the Holocaust, but you can also help survivor families. And that's why people might say it's crass, and it's a controversial thing to write a guidebook about the Holocaust. People, I don't know, you've all seen It's a Real Pain on the new film that's out. I've done guiding like that poor man in the film, and I was like totally sympathetic with him, because it's always the dinners that are the worst, when people have had one too many drinks and there's always somebody who gets over emotional. I was like, he was the go-to identifying character for me in the film. And but the thing is that you do need to know where to go and eat, and you do need to you need to know what's kosher too. And there's all kinds of things you need to know. And particularly when I was in Berlin, I stayed in a chain of hotels called the Hoxton, which is very nice and recommend it to everyone. And it had an Indian restaurant. And I was at that time still researching things about the family. And one day I came back from having gone to see Granny Marion's house, which I hadn't seen before. And I came back to Hoxton and I thought, this is just brilliant. This is the best Germany yet. And I thought, thank God there's an Indian restaurant, and I can be in a nice cafe area to write up what I've done today. And I don't feel harassed. There was like lots of other women working there, and I thought, this is great. You need to know this. You need to know, where is your down place when you're having a Holocaust moment somewhere. And so that was what I would say to critics of Holocaust tourism.
Yeah. But it's true. It's so real, and it's people for so many reasons go on different trips and want to see these places and want to memorialize. And
And some of them are very extraordinary. There's, people often ask me, what's the most moving place you've ever been? Well, it was in a suburb of Berlin called Grunewald. And there's a station there from which huge amounts of Berlin Jews were deported. And it's probably the station from which Granny Marion and Huguette and her family would have been deported from, had they not had the foresight to get out. But it's a little gabled station built at the turn of the century. It looks utterly gingerbready and cutesy. It's still a commuter train station. It's got all the classics of a commuter train station. It has the grab your croissant coffee shop right next door, and it's in a little square. And you go in, and all the trains, commuter trains, and people rushing backwards and forwards. But on the side is a platform with a memorial where the deportations happened. And I found places like that really extremely, extremely moving, because they're literally in front of everybody's face. And that means that this happened in front of everybody's face. And it's part of, but then the memorial becomes part of a place, because there's a supermarket on the other side of the road, which I then went to buy some stuff for lunch. It's kind of weird. There are some places which are extremely strange, and then there are other places which have become so political in themselves. I mean, we obviously, as I said, used to live in former Yugoslavia, and if you go to Jasenovac, as you drive up to Jasenovac, a concentration camp in Croatia, it's surrounded by destroyed buildings that were destroyed during the Balkan Wars, the recent ones in the 90s. And the camp itself was destroyed, and the camp is now divided because the river goes through the middle of it, and one side is in Croatia and the other side is in Republika Srpska, the Serb-controlled area of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So some of these sites are still involved in war. I mean, in Ukraine, it's a very good example of that. There are lots of very important places east of Kharkiv, which that's the front line where my husband couldn't go. And I included in the guidebook also parts of Russia, which are under military rule, which were extremely important in what happened in the Holocaust. At the moment, we can't go there, but Brat are ever optimistic guidebook writers, and we've included it in the hope that we will be able to soon.
Well, thank you so much, Rosie. This was so wonderful, and I'm glad that we could find the time together. And for anyone here, we can send a link out to purchase your book. When we post the video, we'll also put a link to your book. So if anyone wants to read, and I highly recommend. And thank you. And if you're ever in Los Angeles, you're always welcome here. But it's really,
that's very kind of you.
It is a wonderful thing that we could be on two sides of the world and we could still be here together. So
truly, well, thank you so much for having me. And again, I just want to say thank you guys for having me when your lives have been so difficult recently.
Thank you.